In this video, I want to show how we can graph shocks to an economy, and more specifically to an economy that we assume is in a long run steady state. So I've previously made a video on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, or simply ASAD model, but it wasn't very good and it simply wasn't up to standards. What I want to do in this video is I want to go into more detail, and especially I want to talk about the assumptions behind the model. So with everything that's in this model, everything is in the aggregate. There's no individual players, there's no individual markets, there's no individual firms or anything like that. To help understand it, I do want to go a little bit into the algebra, but I'll keep it as simple as possible. I'm basically only doing it just to help you understand the model, and so then we can show what shocks look like, and we can show what shifting the curves looks like. So with that preamble out of the way, and hopefully with my new setup, I've got books behind me, I've got a cool light, I've got a new plug-in, a new way that my microphone is now plugging in. Hopefully it sounds better, and let's get into it. So we are going to set up the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So on the x-axis, we are going to have what is called short-run output gap. Confusingly, this is also referred to as short-run output, but it's not, it's the gap. So basically this follows on from what I was saying at the start, whereby we assume that in the long run, the economy is in harmony, essentially. We're not in a boom and we're not in a bust. So on the right-hand side of this 0 point, we have a boom. We're overusing resources, we're stretching our resources. We're essentially overusing machinery instead of giving it downtime, instead of there being some maintenance on the machinery, and we're also hiring more workers. Okay, so we're in a boom phase. And the opposite can be said. On the negative side of the 0, we have a recession. We're underutilizing resources. So workers that could be working, they're not, and also machinery that could be doing something isn't. So that is the short run output gap, also referred to as Y tilde. So on the y-axis, we have inflation target. More specifically, at the middle point where they meet, we have inflation equals the inflation target. So for most countries around the world, the inflation target is 2%. Generally, that is what is assumed. And we also assume that the central bank doesn't really change the inflation target. It's generally just the level of inflation that's going to change in our model. So even though in the real world, the inflation targets rarely change, if ever, with the ASAD model, we can model this. Fair enough. So we actually have a point where they meet in the graph. And this is where the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand lines will meet. And the point here is that we're in harmony. We don't have any inflation, and we're not in a boom or a bust phase. Fair enough. Let's actually go into the curves. Let's start off with what I think is the simpler one, the aggregate supply curve. This curve, as you can see, slopes upward. So what is the formula for the aggregate supply curve? It is inflation in this period, or inflation in time t, is equal to inflation from the previous period, or simply t minus 1, plus what is called nu, that off-shaped V with the little upper bar on it. That is multiplied by the short-run output gap, or Y tilde, and then we have plus O, or simply the shock parameter. And so because in the long run these equal 0, and so what that means is that inflation this year is assumed to be equal to inflation in the previous year. So if inflation in the previous year was, let's say, 5%, people generally model their expectations that inflation will be 5% this year. And so those two being equal means there's 0 change in inflation. Not that there's no inflation, it's just that there's 0 change. If we have Y tilde also being 0, it doesn't matter what that new value is, it's multiplied by 0. So it doesn't matter how large or how small that number is. So now we have 0 equals 0 plus 0. And in the long run, we assume there are no shocks to the economy. So we have 0 equals 0 plus 0 plus 0. Okay, fair enough, that was nice and easy. Let's actually go into the aggregate demand curve. This one slopes downward. What is the formula for the aggregate demand curve? Now, we have Y tilde, or the short run output gap, is equal to A upper bar minus B upper bar multiplied by M upper bar. And then in brackets, we have inflation minus target level of inflation, and then we have close brackets. So what the hell does all of that mean? So this one's a little bit more complex, so bear with me. So the A upper bar represents, if we actually go back to the national income accounting, we have Y, or simply output, is equal to C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government expenditures, plus exports, minus imports. Fair enough. The assumption that we make for this model, and you do have to forgive it for this assumption, is that all of those expenditures, they remain roughly fixed. Their proportion as compared to output remains roughly fixed from year to year to year. This is roughly what we see in the data. We generally don't see spikes, let's say in imports or exports or government expenditures or tax collection and so on. So all of those are denoted by A upper bar. There is some complex algebra involved in terms of deriving that A upper bar, but the main thing you have to realize is that all of those, we just assume they're a fixed proportion. The reason for this is that if there's no change from last year to this year, we say A upper bar is 0. And so in the long run, we say this value is 0 because we assume once it's settled on a value that it's going to stay that way, that it's stable in the long run. What then is B bar? Okay, and another bit of algebra wizardry, B bar is actually equal to, we have in parentheses, R, capital R, minus little r with a little upper bar on it. We have the real rate of interest minus the marginal product of capital. And so what does that mean? Okay, so we have the real rate of interest is the level of interest you get by investing your money somewhere in the economy. Basically, we assume that there's only two options for your money as a business owner. You either invest your money somewhere in the economy because you're getting a real rate of return over and above inflation. So if this R is really high, or in particular if it's above the little r, you're more likely on the margin to invest your money in the economy. As far as I know for this model, it really doesn't say where people invest their money or how, basically that you just are and that you're getting that real rate of return. That's what that R represents. The marginal product of capital, that little r, that is what you can get for your machinery, what your machinery returns for you. So if for some reason this R is really low as compared to the capital R, you're more likely on the margin to not invest in new machinery because it's not giving you an adequate return. And you're more likely, in this very simple scenario, to invest your money somewhere else in the economy. However, if the opposite is the case, you're more likely to invest in your machinery because in the long term, you're going to get a better return. So the reason we have R minus R is that in the long run, we assume those two are equal. So we assume in the long run, the business owner, he doesn't have an incentive either way. He's indifferent, if you will, to how he's going to use his money. And so he's not going to overinvest in machinery and he's not going to underinvest in machinery. So then we have R minus R, and so they could be 5%, for instance. So that's your B. What about M? Well, M actually is the same as the nu in the aggregate supply curve. M controls the slope of the line. If you have a high level of M, you'll have a very flat AD curve. If you have a low level of M, you have a very steep AD curve. What this represents is how aggressive the monetary policy authorities are, or simply the central banks are, when it comes to changes in inflation. So if they really want to drive down inflation and they communicate this, then they're going to react really quickly to changes in inflation. They're going to raise the rates, and this would be represented by a high value of M. Fair enough. So what's the parentheses? Well, basically is what I was saying before. Inflation minus target. If target is 2%, which it is for most nations around the world, the actual level of inflation can be below or it can be above. But in the long run, we assume these two are equal. So then what we have in the long run, to cap it all off, we have Y tilde is 0, which equals A bar, which we assume is constant, doesn't change, so that's 0, equals B bar, once again, that's 0. M bar can be any value it likes because this is then multiplied by what is in the parentheses, which is the inflation minus target. If those two are equal, if it's 2 minus 2, well, it doesn't matter what the value of M bar is. It's going to net out to 0. So then we have 0 equals 0 plus 0 plus 0. So that is your two curves. That is the algebra behind them. I actually want to go a bit behind the intuition behind the curves. And more specifically, why does the aggregate supply curve slope upward? And why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward? Okay, so the aggregate supply curve slopes upward because it embodies the reactions of firms when there is an output gap, a positive output gap. So what I mean by that is, if we have a positive output gap, we're overusing machinery, we generally assume that there's less downtime for machinery, more people are being hired, and that people are getting paid more. Those people getting paid more, they're spending more on stuff, they're bidding up the prices of things in the economy, and they're pushing up aggregate prices, which is then going to show up as higher inflation. So that's why moving in a northeasterly direction, we have both. We have a positive output gap, we have that boom phase, and we have high inflation. And so that's what happens in that quadrant. We of course can go in the opposite direction, where we can have a slump, or we can have a contraction, or simply a recession, and we would be running under potential. We would be hiring less workers, people are generally getting paid less, so there's less money around, so firms have to lower their prices. They have to lower their prices on everything that's being sold has a lower price, and that also means a lower level of inflation. Fair enough, so that's the aggregate supply curve. What about the aggregate demand curve? It's a bit strange. Why does it slope downward? This is something where you really have to forgive the model. The reason it slopes downward is because of that B bar. That B bar in the equation embodies the reaction of the monetary policy authorities, or simply the central bank, its reaction to a change in inflation. If inflation goes down, what the central bank wants to do is lower the real rate of interest for then activity to pick up. That will mean aggregate prices will rise, and then inflation will pick up and will go up. The opposite is also the case. So if inflation is positive, we raise the real rate of interest to bring down activity. So the thing about this is that this assumes that the central bank reacts immediately, that it's a very, very fast central bank. It's in a speedboat, whereas we don't see this empirically. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the Fed just before the crisis and during the crisis was that it reacted too slowly, and that exacerbated the problem and made it into a global financial crisis. So to finish up this video, what does it mean to move along a curve, and what does it mean for a curve to shift? Okay, let's start off with the aggregate supply curve. Is it a change in inflation? You might think so, but it's actually not. A change in inflation is a movement along the curve, because the aggregate supply curve is change in inflation mapped against the output gap. So a change in inflation simply moves us along the curve. Similarly, a change in that new value only changes the slope of the curve. So it can become steeper or it can become flatter. Also, a change in the output gap only moves us along the curve. So that leaves us with that shock parameter, and that is precisely what the shock parameter is for. Anytime that changes, then we move the curve. Okay, so let's do that. So let's say, as has happened this year, we have an oil price shock, and specifically in this case, we'll say the oil price goes up. The reason this is significant is that oil is an input into virtually everything. So that means when the oil price goes up, all prices, we assume, also go up. Holding the other two values constant, this would then give a positive value to the shock parameter, and we would get a higher level of inflation. How do we get a higher level of inflation? Well, we shift the curve over to the left. This actually makes intuitive sense. When we shift it to the left and when we move up the aggregate demand curve, what we are showing is we have a higher level of inflation with less activity. Why do we have less activity in this specific instance? Well, think about it. When the costs for all your inputs go up, you're going to pass on those prices for everyone else. However, you're not going to work your machinery harder. You're in fact going to work your machinery less because your machinery is more expensive now. The prices for one of your major inputs has gone up. So you'll use your machinery less, you'll underutilize your machinery, and we'll get higher level of inflation. So that's moving the curve over to the left or simply moving it up. What about in the opposite direction? We could drop the price of oil, and this would shift the curve over to the right or simply down. This moves us down the AD curve with a positive output gap or simply a boom phase and lower level of inflation. And once again, this makes sense. The inputs into everything has gone down. It's become cheaper to run all of your machinery. So that's exactly what you do. You're making a lot of money, and also prices are going down. You can pass on those savings from your inputs going down onto the economy, out into the economy. You can run your machinery more, and people have more purchasing power. So they're buying more things and prices are going down. What about the aggregate demand curve? Firstly, is it a change in inflation that moves the aggregate demand curve? And the answer to that is no. A change in inflation simply moves us up or down the aggregate demand curve. What would shift the curve is a change in the target level of inflation. We assume that this doesn't happen. This is a very rare occurrence, but that is something that would shift the curve. Is it B bar or M bar? No. Those only affect the curve itself. They affect the steepness of the curve, because remember, they are multiplied by what is in the parentheses. So that then leaves A bar. This is the primary thing that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve. Let's say all of a sudden there's increased consumer spending over and above what happened last year, and we get a positive A bar. So with this increased consumer spending, holding all of the other factors in the aggregate demand curve constant, we're going to get a positive value for the output gap. So this is going to shift the curve over to the right. This moves us up the aggregate supply curve, and the results make intuitive sense. With the increased expenditures, with nothing else changing in the economy, we're going to get into a boom phase, or simply we're going to be overusing machinery, and we're also going to get higher level of inflation. And of course, we can go in the opposite direction. We could get a negative value, or we could get a lower value for A compared to last year, and we would get into the opposite territory. We'd get a lower level of inflation, and we would also get a short run output gap. We'd get that recession. So that is the basics of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand network. I've shown the very basics of how we can shock our economy. In future videos, I want to actually go into more complicated scenarios, and I want to shift both curves. And I want to show what happens, the interplay of both curves, how they snap back, and all that kind of stuff. And some of the assumptions involved with adaptive expectations and rational expectations. So, hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, rate and share, all the good stuff. It definitely helps my channel, and I'll see you guys next time.